Welcome to the lecture on Introduction to Welding Defects. So, we talked about the welding processes, we have studied about different aspects about the metallurgy of welding, and we will have the now discussion on the welding defects. We will have the try to have the knowledge about the defects which arise because of many reasons, what are the different defect types, and certainly as the lecture goes on, and in our subsequent lectures we will have the different aspects about the welding defects, and we will try to correlate it with this metallurgy of the welding. So, as you know that the performance of the welded structure depends on the quality of fabrication, that is whether there is a presence or absence of defect in the weld joint. So, any departure is there from the specified requirement, that basically tells you that you have the defect in that particular component. Now, principal causes which are which causes for the failure are to failure to follow the requirements of welding specifications, like the main reason which is there for these welding defects are that you are not able to follow the requirements of the welding specifications. Then many a times we use the substandard materials. Then we also have the defective welding equipment, that also many a times we have we use. Then many a times we have the poor welding skill is there. So, the manpower which is there that has not adequate workmanship. So, that may be these are the reasons, and then it may be because of the fault of the designer. So, that is design or drawing error, that may be also one of the reason, because the joint design or the gap or all that which you are trying to give. So, that may not be the proper one. So, that may also lead to the generation of defects. So, that way you have the chance of having the defects. So, if you talk about the classification of the defects, then you have the defects are classified as the cracks. These cracks are different types of cracks, like you have the cold cracks, you have the hot cracks, you have the crater cracks, you have toe cracks. That on the crack we have a lot of we have the understanding in our earlier lectures. We talked about the different types of cracks and its generation. Then you have the cavities. Cavities are also very important type of welding defect, because when as we have understood that when we are doing the welding, during that process actually because of the high temperature, and if there is no proper environmental shielding from the environment, in that case there may be gaseous pickup, or there may be dissolution of gases in the weld, and many a times some of the gases has very high solubility at very high temperature, and very low at when the temperature drops. So, if they are not able to go out, so that they are also going into it. So, cavities may be because of these gases. So, in those cases we you can have the blowholes in the case of welding, where the holes are there inside the weld pool. Then you have you may have the chance of having porosities, you may have the shrinkage. So, all these are the different kind of cavities which may be generated. Then you have the solid inclusions. Solid inclusions will be like you have the slag will be there, or flux is there. So, that is there may be slag trapment or flux that may be trapped inside. Many a times you have the metal oxides, or the when we use the tungsten electrodes. So, in those cases you may have the trapment of the tungsten also in those cases. So, that also may go and that may be seen in those cases. So, these are basically coming under the solid inclusions. Then you have the incomplete fusion or penetration. So, that is further seen, because when you are doing this welding process, in that case you may have the improper fusion may be there may be lack of fusion, there may be lack of penetration, it is not able to penetrate properly. Then you have the suckback effects, so that phenomena may also be there. So, these are the results because of the incomplete fusion or penetration. Many a times you have the imperfect shape. So, imperfect shape means the contour which you are getting, that is unacceptable. So, the way it looks, that is basically not acceptable. So, you will have the dimensional cavitation may be there in those, dimensional deviation may be there in those cases. Then you have the undercut, or you may have the underfill. Then there are also chances of overlap. So, these are the different kinds of defects which are structurally you can see when you are doing the welding. Then many a times what we do is we give the excessive reinforcement also. So, that may be also coming in this category. And then excessive penetration is there, or the bead shape which is not proper. So, all these are under this category of imperfect shape or maybe unacceptable contours. Then also we have the other miscellaneous kind of defects. So, that is like you have the arc strike is there, you have the excessive spatter is there, then you have the rough surface generation, that is another kind of defect which is likely to come in the case of the welding. And you have uneven ripples, and then you have the pock marks. So, these are the defects which are coming, which are under the category of miscellaneous. Now, the thing is that when we are going to discuss about the welding defects, so in this lecture or in the coming lectures we are going to have the discussion of the welding defect basically under two categories. One will be so the category will be, one will be visual or surface defects, and in another category you will have the hidden or subsurface defects. So, so in these cases the defects which are you are able to see, that they are visual or surface defects, and where you cannot see them. So, they are inside of the below the surface, that is your hidden or subsurface defects. So, if you try to have the example of these visual or subsurface defects. So, in that category you will have the surface cracks, then you have the distortion or warpage which is created because of the surface crack, means the crack which is exposed to the surface on which it is appearing, that is surface crack. Distortion or warpage which is created because of the residual stress values or the restraint which we have studied earlier. So, that you can see visually, so that is under the visual crack. Then you have incorrect say profile, bead profile, incorrect or bad bead profile. So, this profile which is looking, which you are able to see, that may be incorrect. So, that is many kind of overlaps is there, undercutting, all that is there. So, that we will see later on. You will have dimensional deviation or incorrect weld size. So, they are basically coming under these the visual surface defects. Then coming to the overlaps, then you have undercuts. So, on the bead you can have the look that how they are overlapping going over the surface, or there is undercut on the side. So, you will have one undercut that is seen, so that will be undercut. You have the underfill. So, that is another thing which is being shown. Then you will have the excessive penetration. So, these about these defects we had studied. So, this is your excessive penetration. Then apart from that you have the unfilled craters. So, that is also among these visual surface defects, where the crater is not getting completely filled. You have the defects like you have interruptions are there. So, that is also that you can see. So, that is among that visible type of defect. You have surface porosity, you have surface oxidation. These are among these defects which are visual or surface, like surface spatter is there many a times. That effect creates the unevenness on the surface, or surface finish is basically gone. So, that is also these are the examples of the visual or surface defects. If you talk about the hidden or subsurface defects, now in these cases we have the lack of fusion shape. So, this can be the defect which is under this hidden or subsurface, because the fusion is not proper. Now, inside that you cannot see visibly, I mean from outside. So, this lack of fusion, that is a defect basically, or lack of penetration. So, it has not penetrated inside and you are not able to see it from outside. So, that is lack of penetration. You have blowholes or subsurface porosity. So, these porosities which are there below the surface. So, basically that will give you these problems in the case that you have to have another means to see it. So, that is hidden. Then you have shrinkage cavities. So, that is again this you have to find it using the special means that what are the shrinkage cavities. You have slag inclusion. So, this is also this is among the hidden or subsurface defects. Then you have tungsten or copper inclusions or metallic inclusions, you can say. Then you have the coarse microstructure, that also you cannot see. So, that is also a defect, and coarse microstructure will be one of the defect, which is a type of hidden defect, or you have the subsurface defect which needs to be controlled, and there are reasons for these. So, when we will discuss about these defects, then we will have some depth we will be talking about it. So, further if you come to the sources of these welding defects. Now, we will talk about the general sources which are there when we are talking about the welding defects. So, the first is that improper selection of the welding process. Now, if you take improper selection of welding process, the end result may be not very rewarding. Like if you are taking a process which is has a very deep penetrating heat source, and if you are putting on the very narrow V angle. So, that basically will cause the crack. So, in the root because of the very large depth to width ratio. So, in those cases you will have to have the improper selection of the process of the welding, so that you get the desired results after the welding. Then the next point is the improper application of the welding process. So, you will have improper application of welding process. So, in this case you are what we mean to say that you are using improper application like improper shielding gas, you are choosing not appropriate the welding current which you need to select. So, because depending upon the dimension of the plates to be joined or depending upon the different processes, the you are not using you don't have the proper current setting, or maybe the gaseous shield is there, that is not adequate, or maybe that you have done improper weld deposition. So, these things basically will be leading to the improper results or the defects in the welded specimen. Then the next point is the interaction of weld metal with prior defects. Now, many a case in many times these weld metal that will be interacting with the defects in the which is already there in the base metal. So, like you have the laminations. So, and you have the impurities like phosphorus is there, sulfur is there, or silicate is there. So, once you will have their interactions, then that may result into undesirable structures, and you will have the brittle zones formed, and that may result into the lamellar tearing. So, if you have suppose you have the laminations and that will be interacting with these impurities which are there. So, we have studied about the lamellar tearing, and their interactions may result into that kind of tearing which is observed, that is lamellar tearing. So, that is because of the interaction of the weld metal with the prior defects. Then you have undesirable metallurgical structures. Now, that is related to the grain size and hardness, because many a times you have undesirable metallurgical structures with respect to the grain sizes. Suppose you have you wanted certain grain size, and grain size is coarsened. So, in welding it is very likely, if you do not control properly, then your grain size will be coarsened. So, that will have the implication on the properties of the structure. So, you will have these with respect to that grain size and the hardness, you may have the undesirable macrostructural or metallurgical structures, and maybe because of the inclusions such as the tungsten oxide or slags. So, that is these inclusions will be also going to have the effect because they are undesirable macrostructures, undesirable metallurgical structures, and that is going to be detrimental for the quality of the weld. Similarly, the hydrogen is another principal constituent material which is a very undesirable type of inclusion, and most of the time, as we have studied, that hydrogen is very much responsible for the cold cracking. So, you will have to have a control on the presence of hydrogen inside the weld. Then apart from this undesirable shape and size of the weld bead, you have the incorrect edge preparation. So, that is so first of all before that you have undesirable shape and size of the weld bead. So, here again you will have to have the look into the profile, weld profile which you are getting. That may be, there may be many reasons. You may have the overfill, you may have overlap, you may have the undercut. So, this is under this category that you have undesirable shape and size of the weld bead. Basically you want a particular, you have for having the ideal property, you have an idealized shape of the weld bead. Now if there is deviation, more deviation, so deviation may be in many forms, like there may be overlap, there may be undercut. So that kind of so that is basically the presence of the weld bead in a not in a very proper shape. So that is your undesirable shape and size of the weld bead. Then you have the incorrect edge preparation. So many a times the edge preparation which is done, and that is not proper, that is not very correct. You have poor fit up, that is also there. So in those cases you are not likely to have the proper, basically the properties, proper welding characteristics. So when you do the welding, it will not give you the optimum properties. So that will lead to many kind of defects, like there may be lack of fusion also there because of the improper fit up or improper edge preparation. Then you have the cracking, or many types of defects have the originations from these incorrect edge preparation that is possible. Then you have the poor supervision, the poor workmanship. So basically if you don't have the proper trained manpower, then that may result into the poor quality of the welding, because the workmanship will certainly talk about many output parameters being affected, like that may result into stray arcing. So arcing may not be even, that there may be stray arcing. Then you may have the tool marks on the job. So that is another example of poor workmanship, or the presence of the unskilled labor who can that can be detrimental for the external appearance of the specimen. Then there may be undercuts and inclusions, poor finish is very much possible, that is what we talked. So that is very much directly the outcome of the poor workmanship of or the inefficiency of the welder. Lack of fusion, lack of penetration, then incorrect weld shape, all these are basically the results of the poor workmanship, or not having proper expertise of the welder which is doing the welding job. So basically these things, when it will not be able to create proper surface profile, proper finish and all that, that will be ultimately affecting the properties of the material, that will be affecting the fitting life of the component. So that is why they are basically important. I mean it is important to have a proper trained welder who should be doing the welding in a proper manner, and also that will be giving you proper joint strength also. So joint strength, fatigue life, these are very important. Then inferior design, that is also very important parameter which has to be looked into. So if you have the inferior design, then that basically will not allow us to do the inspection properly. So that will lead to inaccessibility in the welded specimen, and we will have the inaccessibility in the welding as well as in the inspection, and we will have the hard spots and stress razors will be there. If you have the improper design, then there may be formation of hard spots or stress razor points, which will be basically responsible for leading to cracks, and that may lead to failure of the material. Then you have the difficult welding positions. Suppose you are having that difficult welding positions from where you are welding. So, that may lead to many kind of problems, and maybe quality wise as well as the safety issues are there. Then you have the poor weldability of many a times we take the weld material which has very poor weldability, and which is not the notch ductile. So, in those cases when you are making the weld, then it is more likely to have the defects. So, these aspects need to be looked into when we are going for assessing the weldability of the material. Then so when we talk about the notch ductile, so that's a material basically which will be continuing to form plastically, that is deform plastically, that is known as the notch ductile. So, if it cracks in a rapid brittle manner, it is not the notch tough or notch ductile material. So, based on that basically we are defining this property of the material notch ductile or so. So, apart from these aspects, we may have another aspect also, maybe many other reasons for the occurrence of the specific type of defects. These are only the the defects which we discussed. So, among them the reasons which we have cited, they are for most of the defects. However, there may be specific reasons for some specific kind of defects also. Now, there may be causes for these defects, and there may be special remedies of the defects that can be discussed, that can be discussed later, and that will help you understand that what may be the possible reasons for the onset of these defects, and how they can be removed by changing of the process parameters, operating parameters and so on, and other conditions which are there when you are doing the welding, like choosing of proper environment. You have the proper machine has to be there, proper heat source has to be there. So, there are many reasons that can be the remedy for many specific kind of defects. So, in the coming sections we will be having the introduction about the defects because of the different processes, maybe are due to arc welding, or because there are specific kind of defects which may arise. So, in the coming lectures we will have the discussion about those kind of defects, and also we will be talking simultaneously about the causes and the remedies of these defects. So, that is what about the lecture on these introduction to the welding defects. Thank you very much.